Okay, this is our second session on the history of Jerusalem, Israel, the Jewish people. I know that's kind of a mouthful, but this originally, this series was made or is being made for those who are taking a trip to Israel, especially those who are going from Emmanuel Fellowship. But really, it's for everybody. Um, One cannot understand what is going on today in the Middle East or Israel unless you have at least some understanding of its history. And I hear people all the time talk, just give opinions about what they think about Israel or what's going on, and it doesn't have any context of history. Uh, Likewise, one cannot understand the anti-Semitism that we're kind of seeing growing over and over unless we understand the history of Israel and Jerusalem and the Jewish people. And probably most important is one cannot understand the biblical significance of Jerusalem and Israel and the Jewish people unless they have at least some idea of the history of Israel. Now, having said that, we're not going to do a very thorough history because, as I said last time, we're talking about the history of 4,000 years. In fact, no other civilization has been has there been um, such continuous history uh, than there is of the land of Israel and Jerusalem. And so this is really an overview and uh, and and even a brief overview. Each session we may be covering, like today, we're going to be covering about 600 years, and it's kind of hard to cover everything. I know I'm leaving out a lot. And in fact, one of the things I'm leaving out is a lot of the colorful stories associated with some of the events that we're talking about. And I really encourage you to read on your own. I mean, even if it's just check out Wikipedia or something and find out more about some of this. And as I said, also, probably not today, but in many of the sessions, I'm going to recommend movies that, of course, they're going to have kind of the Hollywood slant to it, but at least you get some idea of what's happening. So, last time we ended with the Great Revolt in 66 to 73 AD. And at that time, the temple was destroyed, Jerusalem was destroyed, and the Jews were scattered. You know, uh, uh, Basically, Jerusalem ceased to be a Jewish city until 1967. But it wasn't just their homeland that was destroyed; their whole system of worship, the Jewish way of associated with the temple and with their priests and all that, the sacrificial system, the priesthood, a whole lot, all that was destroyed. How is Jewish life going to be defined at this point? And so we see a new class of leadership beginning to emerge, and that's the rabbis. Now there were rabbis before, but the priests were dominant. Now there's no need for priests because the priests were involved with the sacrifices, and the sacrifices needed a temple. So all of a sudden, the rabbis emerged as sort of the leadership class of the Jewish people. Prayer, study, ethical deeds became the substitutes for temple sacrifices. And within about 2 decades, a new system pretty much transformed what was called the Diaspora and the remaining Palestinian Jews. And by the way, the diaspora is something that's a word that we probably introduced last week, I think, but it refers to the Jewish communities or settlements living outside of Israel. And and even at the time of Jesus, about half the Jews were living outside of what we know today as the land of Israel. And of course, the diaspora became all of a sudden the majority of Jews, and there were some Jews still living in Palestine, but not nearly as many as before. Now, we also see a growing rift between Christians and Jews. Now, in the first century, many of the Christians were Jewish believers, believers who were Jews that accepted Jesus as the Messiah. But as you go to the second and third and fourth spiritual generations after that, the Jews became less involved. And there is a rift that grew that still is, still affects many Jews today and many Christians today. And we'll talk more about that in, later sessions. But for example, the Jews actually came up with a new benediction for their liturgy that pretty much denounced anyone who strayed from Judaism, including the Judeo-Christians, and really it was a curse. And you could kind of understand Judaism was kind of just being tossed upside down, and a lot of people were leaving. And so they needed to somehow protect their ranks. So I can understand how that happened. Likewise, the church, now mainly Gentiles, they plowed ahead, and Jews all of a sudden were responsible for Jesus's death. They were called monsters. They were called Christ killers. And you begin to see this even from some of the early church fathers. So anyway, so that was kind of the beginning of this rift that is still there even today, especially in some circles. Again, we'll get back to that a little bit later. So now we see the rise of the rabbinic age and elaborate volumes explaining Judaism and the law and the scriptures and Jewish culture were written by rabbis. And just like the early church fathers wrote a lot about early Christianity, these rabbis did much to shape and or maybe even reshape Judaism. Many of these scholars gathered in the Galilee area, especially Tiberias. Another Mecca for rabbis or scholars were in the Babylon area, the Persian area. And they actually were more dominant than the Galilean group of scholars. And 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 eventually, over the decades of these next, of the beginning of the rabbinic age, the Talmud sprung up. And the Talmud was basically a collection of Jewish writings explaining, again, the scriptures, ethics, what it means to be a Jew, Jewish culture, trying to make some sense of, how do you explain the temple now that there is no temple? And they also made a lot of just commentaries on just what was happening. And so the Talmud, if you really want to understand Jewish history, you really need to understand the Talmud. And it's still studied, by the way. The Mishnah would be the Palestinian Talmud or the Jerusalem Talmud. When we say Jerusalem, it was called that, but it was really it came from the more Galilean area. And eventually these two Talmuds, merged together. Now, also during this period of, the first several hundred years after the fall of, of Jerusalem and Israel, you see periods where Christians were persecuted by Rome, and you see the early church fathers trying to, sort of like the rabbis, make sense of how do you explain persecution? Who is the church? What is the church going to be like? And it was, but Christianity began to spread more and more, as you know, in the 100s and 200s and 300s, AD. Jerusalem from 70 to 312 AD was renamed Aelia Capitolina. And this was a Roman version of Jerusalem. And Titus, who had been the general who had, um, destroyed Jerusalem, he died actually 2 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. And he died with these famous words, "I've only done one thing wrong in my life," and which is, um, rather arrogant, but anyway, but he never would say what it was, but Jews were convinced it was the destruction of Jerusalem and that his death was really God's judgment on that. In 130 AD, the emperor orders a new city to be built on the site. That was Emperor Hadrian on the site of the old one. He wanted a distinct Roman city. And before that, there was only about 10,000 people in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was really not that big, considering it had been a big, um, you know, a big city at one time. Now, it was also about this time that we see a revolt, and this was a revolt that was led by Simon Bar Kochla, and and he led this revolt in 132 A.D. He was Jewish, and he actually helped establish a 3-year-long Jewish state in which he was the prince. In fact, he called himself the Nisa, the prince, and he called the new country the House of Israel. Now, I know I said a few minutes ago that Jerusalem basically was a non-Jewish city for from 70 to 1967. And that's true. There are a couple little exceptions. This might be one exception, but on the other hand, um, Simon Bar Kokhba, he had a hard time controlling everything. Uh, a lot of the rabbis who were writing thought of him as the long-awaited Messiah, and they got behind him. In fact, the Talmud said that, he led an army of 200,000 or over 200,000 people to revolt against Rome. That may be a little bit exaggerated, but it was obviously a big revolt, and Rome was kind of, pushed out of, the land of Palestine for a few years, probably for a good year and a half anyway. And and it was the Emperor Hadrian who comes back, puts down the revolt, restores order, and he reconfigured the administrative area of the Middle East, and it was one big area called Syria, and he felt like that would probably be more advantageous. Um, um, the Jews had been longing for a, you know, a return to their homeland, that they were in charge. And so Simon Bar Kokhla, he was a very charismatic type of person. He drew a lot of people. He was also not just kind of a general, but he was kind of a preacher too. And so it was really easy for people to get behind him. And again, there are a lot of stories associated with him, uh, you know, especially being the Messiah and, what he was going to do. However, after the whole thing after the whole thing was crushed down, he actually, the Talmud began to kind of say that called him a false Messiah, because actually life was much worse for the Jews after that. You know, they, you know, they, the Jews were allowed, a small number of them, in what is now called the Jewish quarter, and they were allowed to stay there, but they, it was very limited. Most of the Christians, by the way, who were living in Palestine at that time, lived in or near the city of Caesarea. Remember, we talked about him last time. We talked about that last time. It's that big giant city that King Herod had built. Okay, so let's go on. Probably the next big thing that really happens was Emperor Constantine. He would change the world and Jerusalem, and he ruled from 306 to 337 AD. His mother, Helena, was a Christian, and in a battle, uh, he is losing, and you can kind of read the whole thing, and he looks up and he sees in the clouds what he thinks is kind of a cross. And basically, Lord, if you help me, I'm going to serve you. And he won. And so in 313, the Edict of Milan, he declared that Rome was going to have complete religious tolerance, and that Christianity would be um, he didn't kind of say this at first, but within a couple of decades, it would be the preferred religion, and then it would be the religion of Rome. Now, whether or not Constantine was truly a Christian or not, you know, uh, there's people on both sides say, no, there's no way because of this and this and this. In fact, he even uh, was not baptized until the very end of his life. And then I think he kind of did it maybe for more security to make sure he was in heaven. Uh, Other people kind of point to things that kind of suggest that maybe he did have some understanding of the scriptures. We don't know, but it did change things completely. Christianity went from being a persecuted uh, church to to all of a sudden they were in power, and really because of the state involvement and the state uh, church uh, connection and relationship, it really, looking back, it really caused a lot of damage to the church. But anyway, that's really another um, story. But Helen, or Helena, his mom, she was a great influence on her son, and she lived till she was 80 years old, and uh, and she was already old when all of a sudden Constantine, kind of came out with his Edict of Milan. But she goes to Palestine on a pilgrimage, and she begins looking for all the key places in Jesus's life. Now, of course, we're talking 250, 270 years after Jesus, but still she, there's a lot of word of mouth, oral traditions, and she makes it her goal to pinpoint exactly where the major events in Jesus's life took place. And in fact, uh, historians call her the first archaeologist, because she actually used some amazing research skills. She kind of had people kind of digging up ruins, and she was also a historian too. And she found, at least she named almost all the key places in Jesus's life. And over the years, with later archaeology, we've discovered that she was actually pretty accurate. I mean, amazingly accurate in most of her discoveries. There's a few things in Jerusalem, especially where Jesus died, where he was, where he was buried, resurrected. That's a little bit more. We're not so sure she was too accurate on that. But you have to kind of remember Jerusalem had been destroyed and kind of built up again. And, he'd gone through a number of changes already. So that's kind of understandable. And so as those who are going to Israel, we might kind of point out to certain things that, that Queen Helen, or Helena, she discovered this, and you know what she did a lot of times, she kind of had a church built over it. So there's the Church of the Nativity built over where Jesus was, thought to be born. There's a church on the Mount of Olives. There's a Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that, where Jesus supposedly died. And that's probably one of the things that was, kind of questionable. And we'll talk more about that at another time. She also became later obsessed with finding the true cross of Jesus. And, she actually kind of came up with a technique that is not very scientific. She offered rewards for anyone who could find pieces of that cross. So everyone kind of had pieces of the cross, they're bringing. And so she kind of put it together, what she thought was kind of the cross that Jesus had. That is probably, most historians now kind of view that with a lot of skepticism. But she was able to pinpoint a lot of the places, and she was later made a saint. She died in 330 at the age of 80, and again, she had a very significant part in the land of Israel and in Jerusalem. Okay, so from 312 to 518, Jerusalem was sort of a Christian city. Now, I say Christian city because I'm not so sure it's always very Christ-like, but it was a Christian city as opposed to being Jewish or Islam or something like that. In 339, a lot more anti-Jewish laws were established and began to be enforced in Jerusalem. Also, very sadly, it was during this period that a lot of corruption. I mean, there were sex networks kind of, in Jerusalem. It was really a very, a very sad commentary on Jerusalem being a Christian city. One of the things that kind of happens about this time is there is a divide in the Roman world. And it really started with Constantine. He built a second capital, Constantinople, named after himself. It is now what city? Istanbul, right? And and because he felt like the Roman Empire is so big, we really need to have two capitals. Well, what happened was eventually over the next 50, 100, certainly 200, 250 years, there was a divide between more the Roman area and more the Eastern area. And the Eastern area became, it became really the Byzantine Empire. And the Roman area became more the Roman Empire. And so there's a really dividing of the kingdoms. Rome ended up sort of going in decline. The Byzantine Empire actually flourished for hundreds and hundreds of years after Rome, sort of fell apart. Also, remember, I think we mentioned last time that Greek was still the sort of the language of the trade language of the Mediterranean area. And the Byzantine Empire or the Eastern Empire, they kept the Greek language. And they also, the church began to uh, emerge somewhat independently from Rome too, and it's because it became the beginning of the Greek Orthodox Church, and later, of course, there was a Russian Orthodox, and a lot of other Orthodox churches. In Rome, they switched to Latin, and they rejected Greek, and they became, the the Roman Church became more the Catholic Church. And so this was pretty significant because with time, the Byzantine Empire began to have dominance over Palestine in that area and Jerusalem. And when it happened, a lot of the corruption actually, you know, was, it was eradicated, thanks to, the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire, by the way, and I don't want to kind of go off on this, but there's Justinian. He was a very important, you know, emperor in the Byzantine Empire and really put in a lot of good reforms, cleaned up everything, a lot of the carryover from the Roman days. And he was, most people kind of, and he also did a lot just helping to establish the Greek Orthodox Church. Okay, so um, let's kind of go on. Let's kind of mention something else. Uh, there's a, in the 600s, there was a Persia, one of the late one of the last great shahs or rulers of Persia was named Khusrau, or sometimes you'll see it pronounced or written uh, uh, Kochla. And he was kind of sometimes called Khosrau the Victorious. And he was the last great um, Persian Shah. He was Zoroastrian, although he had a wife that was kind of from the Nestorian part of the church. So he was kind of a little bit mixed. But anyway, he began to. Um, he's known for really pushing back the Byzantine Empire. The Persian Empire just grew during his time. Actually, they went all the way to Constantinople and almost, and put siege to it. He couldn't quite conquer it, but he did. Um, he took away a lot of the Byzantine Empire. You know, he also, um, you know, he also uh, went into Palestine and Jerusalem and took over the Jerusalem, and his general the royal Boar is a very one of those colorful people. I mean, he was kind of written. He was even kind of adopted by some of the Islamic writings later, and kind of made a hero, and the romance and the. I mean, he's a very colorful person, but he's the one that kind of took it. He was a brilliant. He was really sort of the person, the military genius behind the rise of the Persian Empire there, and but in May of 614, he stormed Jerusalem. He destroyed almost all the churches. In 3 days, 3,000 Christians were massacred. 37,000 of them were deported to Persia. And the royal Boar gave Jerusalem back to the Jews and killed more Christians for 3 years. So, but it didn't kind of end well for the Persian Empire, because the new emperor of Byzantine, Heraclius, and he was Armenian descent. He was blind, and he reconquered almost all the area that Byzantine had lost. And in fact, when he kind of on March 21st, 630, he rides into Jerusalem, and he actually uh, kind of had the Golden Gate that'd sort of been destroyed kind of fixed up where he could kind of ride through it on that occasion. We'll talk more about the Golden Gate a little bit later, but I want to mention that to you. And he also returns the true cross to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Um, he, unfortunately, when he came back in, the Jews were expelled, but he also killed a lot of the Jews. In fact, almost all the Jews in Jerusalem were massacred, because he wanted it to be a Christian city and not a Jewish city again. And the reason I mention this, just to kind of give you the where you can appreciate some of the feeling of some of the Jews when they kind of think about their history with Christianity. It was one of just constant massacres and going back and forth, and there are problems on both sides. I mean, certainly Christianity in this time was not biblical Christianity of love your enemies and serve one another, and the things that we kind of talk about today. Okay, so I think I mean, actually, just kind of a little side thing. The when Heraclius, he actually defeated um, Khusrau II at the Battle of Nineveh in 627, and he had him executed. But the royal Boar took over and tried to restore once again the Persian Empire, but he was not able to do it. But anyway, it's just kind of a side thing. So I think this is probably a good place to kind of end for this time. Next time, we're going to start talking about the rise of Islam and how that affected, Jerusalem and Israel. And we also want to talk about the Crusades. Thank you.